Hey, this is Justin. Welcome to Lesser Talk Tutorials, and this is part 11 in the 2D point-and-click adventure game tutorial series for Unreal. And this is the last part of the Dialog series. And so let's kick things off because we have a lot to cover, and I hope you like blueprints because you'll be seeing a lot of them. So last time what we did was we set up everything in the Dialog to prepare ourselves for the Dialog system to be implemented. We created these data tables and stuff that has all the information. So let's create a variable in the BP underscore NPC blueprint. We're going to call it topic list, and it's going to be of the type data table, and it is an array. And this will hold all the topics that any NPC might be able to say. Like, for instance, if we open up the NPC eyes blueprint, we have that topic list. We'll add 2 elements, and we'll put in the intro and the tower topics. So we need to make another variable. However, if you recall, we created 2 different structs. The first one is called prompt data, and that contains all the information for a single prompt. And the other struct we created was called conversation data, which holds an array of those prompt data structs. So in the blueprint for the NPC, we'll create another variable called conversation data. And the variable type will be the conversation data struct, but it will be an array of conversation data structs, which essentially means it will hold all of the information in all of the topics for the NPC. So now let's create a new function called fill conversation data, and in there create a local variable called temp prompt data array of the type prompt data. So this function is going to fill in the conversation data based on the topics and data tables that we have for the NPC. So drag in the conversation data, and we're going to check if it is valid at index 0, meaning is there any information in here already? And if there is, then we don't need to do anything because we've already loaded the data or the data already exists, so there's no reason to run this function. And if it's false, that's when we're going to go through the data tables and populate the information in the conversation data variable. So drag in the topic list, and then from that, we're going to do a for each loop. Connect that to the branch. And the first thing we'll do is clear the temp prompt data array because this will be used for each topic. So drag out from the array element, and we're going to get data table row names. And now we have a list or an array of all of the row names. And then we'll do a for each loop through those as well. So it's going to then drag out from the array element, maybe one of those reroute nodes at the top. And then we're going to get the data table row using a name, which we just link up to the array element of the for each loop. So all this is doing so far is getting each row from each topic in the topic list for the NPC. Now we'll get that temp prompt data array and add this row or each row to that. And then we can drag out the conversation data, split that struct pin, which just shows the prompt array in the conversation struct. And then we'll add the temp prompt data array to that when the for each loop is completed. And then it'll go through the next topic and do the same thing. And so our conversation data will be populated with all of the information that exists in both topics or all topics. And then we can add a comment in this section and just say it creates a new conversation data. And then from that first for each loop, we'll drag out from the completed output and it'll go to the return node. And then in the event graph, let's add a couple custom events. And the first one will be called save conversation data. And then the other one will be called load conversation data. They'll stay empty for now, but we will be using these later. Up here in the event begin play, let's call that load conversation data event we just made, which will be filled out later. And then after this, we will run the fill conversation data function. So if there is something to load, it will load. And then when the fill conversation data runs, it'll see if the data exists or not. And if it doesn't, it'll make it. Next, we can just remove the event tick and the overlap event. and then we'll create another function, and we'll call this update prompt at index. And then we'll add 2 additional inputs, and the first one will be called topic index, and the second one will be called prompt index, and both of these will be integers. And the topic index is just the index of the topic list array, and then the prompt index is going to be the index of the prompt within a given topic. So let's create a new local variable, which means we'll just be using it in this function. And we'll call it temp topic index, and it will be of the type integer. And then we'll make a temp prompt index of the type integer as well. And we can hook these up right at the beginning and just drag in these prompt and topic index and set those to these temp integers. Next, we'll drag in the conversation data. And then from that, we'll get a reference at the temp topic index. Next, we want to get the prompt at the temp prompt index, but we need to first split the struct here. And now we can see that array, and then we can get a reference using this temporary variable, which now allows us to get a single prompt at the current topic. So now we'll want to drag out from that get, and then we'll break the prompt data so we can see all the elements within the specific prompt. So we'll create a new variable called temp single use, and it will be of the type Boolean. And all we're doing is just taking all of this information and storing it in different variables. So the first one is this temp Boolean that we'll store the single use Boolean into. So now let's create a variable called npc bark array and make it of the type text and make sure it's an array. And then for the player prompts, let's create a local variable called temp player prompts, and it will be of the type text and an array. And we'll save the player prompts to that. And then we'll save the npc response array to the npc bark array. Now for the topic, we can add a new local variable, and it will be called temp topic. And it will be a single variable of the type data table. And then we can set that to be the switch topic variable. So if there is nothing here, it will be empty, but if there is a topic to switch to, it will have something. And now the end conversation Boolean, we can create a normal variable for that. We'll call it conversation over. Obviously, it needs to be a Boolean also. And then we'll just set that to be the ends conversation bool. And then lastly, we have this event string. And you should create a function. I'm creating a macro, but it makes more sense to create a function called process event string, because then you can override it in inherited NPC blueprints. So what you want to do is add a string input, and then you can just take that string and just compare it to whatever strings that you want to write. And then if it matches a certain string, you can run some event like giving the player an item or unlocking a door or whatever else you want to do. And then you just hook up the event string to that function right at the end here. And then I'm going to add a comment on this section, and I'll just call this assign prompt data. And so now we have taken the prompt apart and read all of the information we need and assigned it to variables. And now we can work with these variables and perform the actions that happen when the player clicks on one of their prompts. So the first thing we'll do is check if the prompt being clicked is set to single use. If so, we want to hide the prompt so it doesn't show up anymore. So right now, I'm going to take that false branch and stick it way out of the way because we're not going to use that for a while. Now let's drag in the temp prompt index, and then from that, we're going to increment it. And this is going to be connected to the true output of the branch. And we'll create a new local variable called temp next prompt index of the type integer, and we'll set that to be what the outcome is of this increment. So the idea is we're just adding 1 to the temp prompt index and setting that to the temp next prompt index variable. And then we're going to drag in the conversation data. We'll do what we did before and get a reference at the temp topic index, split that struct, and then get the length this time to compare it to the next prompt index. And we're going to see if the temp next prompt index is less than the length of the prompt array at the temp topic index. And then we'll add a comment over all this, and we'll just say, check if there is another row on the data table. And the data table is the topic. And for the row, we can say that is the prompt. Then it helps kind of understand what this stuff means. And I'll just add a reroute node up here for the false output of the branch, and then I'll drag it out to be where the other reroute node is, because this is something that will be used later, and we could just get it out of the way for now. So if this is true, meaning there is another row after this one, then we're essentially going to check if it should replace this one. So from this conversation prompt array, we can add a reroute node and extend it out because we'll be using it. And I'm just going to add a comment on this, and I'm going to call it the topic and then in parentheses data table. So it helps me kind of see what this is. So now we're going to get the temp prompt index and then drag out the temp next prompt index. And we're going to get from this conversation data node, and we're going to get the array element at both of these indexes. And then from the output, we're going to break the prompt data struct. And what we're checking is if the prompt subnumber of the prompt at the temp prompt index is less than the subnumber of the next prompt. And if it is, that means we're going to be enabling the next one. So I'll just add a comment over this section, and I'll say that it is checking if the prompt subnumber increases on next row. And then I'll just say that the row is the prompt. So if this is false, then it's going to continue on that top line there, just like the previous one did. And that is the same as the true output on that single use branch, because it initially was a single use prompt. So if this is true, that means the next prompt needs to be set to visible. So grab that prompt at the next prompt index over here, and I'll just add a little comment on there that says next prompt in topic. And I'll add a reroute node, and I'll extend it out and add another reroute node. And then what I'll want to do is set members in the prompt data struct. And then from this, I will drag out from the output, and I'll do set array element. And then from the struct out, I'll link it up to the item. And for the index, I'll grab the next prompt index and link that up. And for the target array, I'll just grab the nodes from over here that gets the current topic. Now, I'm not sure if you specifically need to use this set array element function. It might work if you just set the members in the prompt array, but better safe than sorry. Now, if you select the set members in prompt array, you can actually select which members you want to change. So select the visible box, and then we want to make this visible. Then we'll just add a comment that says set next row or prompt to visible. So after this is complete, we will connect back up to the top line, which is the true output on that single-use branch. Now we're going to do what we did before and get the current prompt. So we'll get the conversation data. We'll get a reference at the temp topic index. We'll split that struct and then get a reference at the temp prompt index. So then what we want to do is set members, and we'll do it twice. So we'll split that into two, and the bottom of this single use branch, or the false, will go to the bottom one, and the true will go to the top one. So if it is single use, that means we're setting visible to false, and then we'll say it has been selected, and on the bottom one is just the has been selected bool that we'll set to true. So really all this is doing is determining whether or not the current prompt should be visible or not based on if it is single use. So I'll just make a comment box and say set current row visibility and has been selected to true. Now we will run the save conversation event that's on the event graph, which will come into play later. And I'll just add a comment that says save data. And then we'll create a new macro that we'll call assign new topic. And what this is going to do is if there is a new topic to switch to, it will look through the topic list, find the index number that the topic is located at, and that will be used to determine which prompts will be visible. So we can drag it in to run after we save the conversation data. However, we need to add an input of the type data table, and we'll just call this topic. And then we can pass in that local variable of the temp topic so that we know what topic to look for if there is one. So we'll add a comment and just call this assign new topic if it exists. Now let's figure out the logic for this macro. So we'll drag out from the topic and we'll check if it's valid first. Next, we can drag in the topic list and we'll do a for each loop. And we're just going to see essentially if the array element is equal to the topic we're passing in. And then we'll branch. And then if the topic is equal to the topic we're passing in, then we'll want to add a variable here called current topic index. And then if it's true, we'll set it to the current array index. Next, we can connect the output to the completed output of the for each loop and the is not valid output of the is valid node. Next, we need a reference to the prompt list widget. So let's create a getter in our blueprint library. So we'll call this get prompt list widget and make sure it is set to pure. And we'll add our return node with an output of the type prompt list widget, and we'll call that prompt list. And all we'll be doing in here is getting the HUD widget, and then from that, getting the prompt list, and then connecting it to the output. And we can move that to the getters category, and then we'll create a new function, and we'll call this hide player prompts. And then we'll put that in a category that's called Dialog. And this will get the prompt list widget. And then it will run the hide player prompts function on the prompt list. And then this is what we'll be running here in the NPC blueprint. We'll be running the hide player prompts function. And then we'll add a new variable called ready to bark and make it a Boolean. And we'll set this to true, and this helps us know that the NPC is ready to say what it needs to say after the player has said what he needs to say. So we'll get the adventure controller here, and then we'll run the task player bark, passing in the temp player prompts that we assigned earlier. And you can see that here. So really, it just means that the player is going to say the things that it needs to say, and then we know the NPC is ready to bark. It's got its bark array ready to go, and we will run that using an event dispatcher later. So now let's go to the event graph, and we'll make a custom event called bind click events, and then another one called unbind click events. And if we go back to the prompt widget blueprint, so the player prompt widget blueprint, you might remember that when it's clicked, it calls an event dispatcher called prompt clicked. So what we need to do in the NPC event graph is assign these click events to the update prompt at index function. So the first thing we'll want to do is get the prompt list widget and then get prompt 1 and bind event to the prompt clicked. So we'll just create a new custom event that will be the event we're binding. So we'll call this prompt 1. And then if you connect up the event to that, so this event will run when the prompt is clicked. And then we can drag out from prompt 1 again and say unbind event from prompt clicked so that we can unbind it when needed. So now the only thing that's needed is that we run the update prompt and index from this event. And then for the topic index, we want to get the current topic index, which will be 0 by default. And if it switches topics, then that's when it's updated to the new topic index. And then for the prompt index, the one we're going to choose, we're going to create a new variable called active prompts, and it will be an integer array. And we'll get into what this is specifically later. But for now, we're just going to get a copy or a reference, it doesn't matter. And we'll leave that bottom index number at 0. And we'll just move the save and load conversation data away a little bit. And then now we have essentially the information we need to run when we click a prompt. So we can duplicate this now for each of the other prompts that we would have in our prompt list. So it should be a total of 5. And then I'll just rename this last one to prompt 5. And then the next one to prompt 4. I'll go down the list here. This one would be prompt 3. And then this one would be prompt 2, but it looks like we have an extra one, so I'll just delete 1. There we go. And then I'll rename this one to prompt 2. And if you remember, if we go to the prompt list, I only have 5 entries, but you can have as many as you want. I guess only 6 would really fit. But I keep 5 in there because sometimes we might have 2 lines here or there. So then I'm just going to connect these bind and unbind event nodes together. The update prompt and index nodes don't need to be connected to anything. There we go. And now each of them are bound, but we need to change this number on the active prompt, so we'll go sequentially up. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So we're just getting each entry in this active prompt array. Next, we'll want to drag out from the get prompt list widget because we're going to want to get each of these prompts. So for the next one, we want to get prompt 2, and the one after that, we want to get prompt 3, etc. And be sure to connect them to both the bind event and the unbind event. Now that that is finished, I'm just going to add a comment over this section, and I'm going to call it Dialog Prompt Events, and then just kind of a check over to make sure everything's connected, and it looks good. So now I'm going to move these save and load events over here. I'll add a comment that just says events to be overridden. Now I'm going to recreate the bark sequence and timeline and functions that you would see on the adventure character blueprint, but this will be for the NPC. So I'll add 3 custom events: bark delay, bark reset, and bark time. I'll add in a timeline I'll call bark timeline. And then for the bark time, I'll get the bark timeline from the event graph. And then from that, I will set the timeline length and then add the input for this event called bark time, which is a float. And I'll set the timeline with that. And we don't need to change the bark timeline or open it at all because every time we bark, the timeline will already be set to whatever we pass in the bark time. Now we'll create a new function called clear bark. And then I'm going to get the HUD widget and I'll clear the bark because we'll be using the same bark widget for everyone. And then I'll run bark reset. And then I'll drag clear bark in right after the finished output node on the bark timeline. And then next, I'll do a delay for 0.2 seconds. And then I'll create another function called NPC bark sequence. And this will be very close to the adventure character's bark sequence except for a couple of small changes. Lastly, for the event graph, I'm going to override the event on talk to do a default reaction if an NPC has no conversation data. So the first thing I'll do is face down, and then we need to create a function in the hotspot blueprint that will call player single bark. And this will just pass in text that we'll call bark text. And all it's going to do is get the player controller and then run task single player bark. And so back in the NPC, we can run the single player bark. And what we'll type in is just something like, I don't think they want to talk to me. Then we will clear the verb. Simple. And I'll just add a comment that says default talk response. Now we can figure out that bark sequence. And the first thing in this bark sequence that we'll want to do is check if the NPC is ready to bark. And then we'll want to check if the NPC is currently barking. So we'll need to make a new variable, which will be a Boolean, and we'll check that if the ready to bark branch is true. Next, we're going to create another variable, and it's going to be called current response index, and its type will be integer. And we'll want to set this if the is barking branch is false, and we'll set it to 0, and then we'll set is barking to true. Then we'll need to get the HUD widget, add a bark, and the bark that we're adding is the bark in the bark array at the current response index. So we'll get a copy, and we'll get that current response index as the index to get, and we'll attach that to the bark text input of add bark. And then we'll just attach the text color and the bark position to the other inputs. And then we'll want to drag out from the current bark and get the bark time so that we can run the bark time event on the event graph. And then lastly, in this little area, we will run the bark delay event on the event graph, which of course runs the timeline, clear bark delay, and then the bark sequence again. So now if is barking is true, then we're getting the length of the bark array to check if it's equal to the current response index incremented by 1. So I'll just add a comment on this section and say it is check if bark array is complete. And then we'll set the current response index to the incremented value, and then we'll clear the current bark. And we'll move all this stuff over because we want to connect now to the line right before we add the new bark and run that bark delay. So if this is true, meaning we are now at the end of the bark array, then we set is barking to false, ready to bark is false, and then clear the bark. Then we want to get the conversation over bool and check if it's true or false, because we want to know if we should end the conversation or show the player's prompts again. So if it's false, we'll just add a reroute node and add a comment here that says show prompts again. And if it's true, we add another reroute node and a comment that says end conversation. And that's basically what these will be doing, so we need to create the functions for those. So let's create a new function called start conversation, and we'll create another function called end conversation. And then for the end conversation area on this NPC bark sequence, we can just put that end conversation function. And we'll create another function called show player prompts. And then we can put that on the show prompts again area that we have there. on the false section of the conversation over branch. And then we should be done with the NPC bark sequence. We just need to fill out the information in these functions. So for the start conversation function, we'll kick things off with bind click events. And if you remember, that binds all of these events to the update prompted index function for each of the prompts that you click. Next, we're going to get the adventure character, and we will run the clear bark function so that if the character's talking, it will stop that from happening. And then we will set the active conversation NPC on the character to this NPC. And then we'll get the adventure controller and set a bool that we need to make. So we'll head over to the adventure controller and add a variable, and we'll call this conversation active. And then compile and save. We'll head back over to the NPC and we'll set that bool to true. Next, we'll need to get that NPC bark array, and from that, we'll clear it, just in case there's anything left over from before. And then we want to add an input parameter of type text that we'll call intro text. And this will be the text that the NPC will say right when the conversation is starting. And then I'll just add some reroute nodes to extend it out here a bit, because we'll be using it in the next thing, which is we need to create a function that adds a single line to the bark array. So we'll create a new function that is called add single bark to array. And it will take in a text parameter called bark text. And I don't know if you can guess, but what it's going to do is add a bark to the bark array. But since we added a bark to the array, we now need to set ready to bark to be true. Now back in the start conversation function, we can run that add single bark to array and link up the intro text that we passed in as the input parameter. Then we'll need to lock the player input so they no longer can move while the conversation is active. Then we'll need to create a function where we enable the dialog widget in general and hide the HUD. Let's head over to the adventure library. We'll create a new function called EnableDisable, and it will get the HUD widget, and then from that, enable the dialog widget. However, we don't have any sort of function that does that on the HUD. So let's head over to the HUD and create that. So we'll create a function that we're going to call EnableDialogWidget. So we'll drag in that widget switcher, and then from that, we'll get the set active widget index, and we'll switch it to 1. And the reason we're choosing 1, if you look at the designer tab, you'll see that under the widget switcher, the first child is the UI area and the second is the prompt list. That means the UI area is index 0 and the prompt list is index 1. So we'll add another function called DisableDialogWidget, and it will do the same thing, but switch the index to 0, which is the standard UI. So back in the adventure library, in the EnableDialogWidget function, we want to run EnableDialogWidget from the HUD. And then here in the NPC start conversation function, we can enable the dialog widget. Next, we want to hide the player prompts, which runs the hide player prompts function on the dialog widget. And then we will run the NPC bark sequence, and then return. And then we want to add an output parameter of the type float, and we'll call that bark length, and we'll drag out from that single line and get the bark time. Now for the end conversation function, we're going to almost do the exact opposite. We'll unbind the click events, and then we need something that disables the dialog widget. So in the adventure library, we will create a function here that does almost exactly what the enable dialog widget does, except for it'll be called disable dialog widget, And if it's not obvious enough, this will be running disable dialog widget on the HUD. So back in the end conversation function, we will run that function, the disable dialog widget. And then we will unlock the player input so they're free to move. And then we'll take that NPC bark array and just clear it again. Probably don't need to, but it won't hurt anything. And then we'll reset the conversation over bool and set that to false. And then we'll get the adventure character and set the active conversation NPC to nothing. And then we'll get the adventure controller and set the conversation active to false. And that should be all for the end conversation function. Now in the show player prompts function, we want to get the active prompts, and this is from earlier, and we're going to clear that. And then we're going to get the conversation data array, and we're going to get a reference using the current topic index. Then we'll split that struct pin so that we can get the array, and we'll do a for each loop right after we clear the active prompts. And then we'll want to make a new local variable that we'll call total prompt index, and this will be of the type integer. And then we're going to set this variable to the array index of the for each loop. So we're going through the prompts in the current topic, and with each array element, we want to break the prompt data, and we're going to branch and see if this prompt is visible. And if it is, we're going to get the HUD widget, then we'll get the prompt list from that, and then we'll set the prompt text to be equal to the first entry in the player prompt array. So if the player says multiple things, you'll only see the text of the first entry in that array. And then we'll set the has been selected to the has been selected bool of the current prompt. Then we'll create a new local variable called visible prompt index. And we'll get that and connect it to the row index input of the setPromptText function. And then we'll get those active prompts and add the total prompt index, meaning every time one of these prompts is visible, then we're adding that prompt's index to this array so we know which ones are going to be visible. Then we will increment the visible prompt index so that we know which prompt in the prompt list that the player can choose is where we're setting the data for the active or visible prompt. The visible prompt index is referring to the rows in the prompt list widget. And then the total prompt index is talking about the rows in the data table or the topic. So the total prompt index is going to be what row are we on? It keeps incrementing every time we go through the body of the array. But the visible prompt index only increases once we set one of the prompt entries to the data of a visible row. There's one more thing we need to do real quick before we test this out. And over in the HUD, we set the bark active when we add a bark, but we never set the bark active to false when we clear the bark. So let's do that here. Over in the tower interior level, we're going to go to brush editing, uncheck the create convex polygons, change the extrude depth to 4, and we'll just draw a box over the eyes. And we'll create the static mesh and save it in the meshes folder. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name it NPC eyes. And then I'll just delete that. And then I'll assign it in the NPC eyes blueprint. But first I will assign the hotspot material to it. And then in the blueprint, I'm going to select the static mesh component and then select the NPC eyes mesh. So now I think I want to change this material to be see-through. I thought I did this before, but I guess maybe not. But hold 1 and left click to create a constant, and we'll connect that to the opacity. And then we'll change the blend mode from opaque to translucent. And then we'll set that constant to 0.5. And if we save that and look at it, you can kind of see through stuff now. But why don't we change it from green to something else like purple or pink? And now it's going to separate itself a bit from the nav mesh area. Now let's set up what happens when you talk to the eyes in the hole. We'll override the event talk to. So the first thing we'll do is face the hotspot. We'll start the conversation, and maybe the NPC will say, yeah. And then we'll do a delay based on the bark length. And then we will show the player prompts. And then we will clear the verb. Let's see what that does. So I have a saved game, so I loaded it. Now I'm going to talk to the eyes, and he says, yeah. And now the prompts have shown up. And if I click one, like, how did you get in there? He won't respond. So we need to set up the event that registers the event called on the adventure character. So if you see in the player bark sequence, we do the call finish talking event dispatcher. We need to register that on the NPC. So in the NPC's event graph, we're going to get the adventure character, bind event to finish talking, and we can connect that to the end of the bind event to prompt clicked chain. And then we'll create this new event that we'll call player finished talking. And we'll set that up just like the other events. Make sure to bind and unbind this event here. And then when this event's called, all it's going to do is delay for 0.2 seconds and then run the NPC bark sequence. So now let's see how that works. I'll load my game and then I'll talk to the eyes. He says, yeah. I say, how did you get in there? And then he says his lines. And then the prompts come back up. There are two issues though. One is this, the text will jump when there's multiple lines. You can see it happen. And the other issue is with the single use prompts. They're not removing the lines they should. So let's fix that. Over in the update prompted index, let's remove this increment node. And instead, we're going to add 1 to it. And that's because the increment node actually sets the integer as opposed to just temporarily adding a number. So let's try doing this again. We'll talk to the eyes in the hole. And now if I say something like, how did you get in there? And he responds, it won't remove the next line. Instead, it will remove itself. And so now I can test out the other things like, what's your favorite color? He'll say blue, and the next line should appear, which is, what do you like to do for fun? And then he'll say, look through holes. And then the next line will appear, what's your favorite book? Then he'll say the thesaurus. And then that chain of questions is gone. And then if we say, who are you? This won't go away. It should just show that it has been read, which it did. Now it's darker. And then if I say I have some questions about this tower, it should switch topics to the other topic. And let's see what he does. Okay, he says shoot, and then now all the other options are available. So if I ask a question like, when was this tower constructed? He'll say some stupid answer. And now we're still in this topic, and then I can say I'm done asking questions and remove myself from this topic and move back to the first one. And perfect. And now I can leave the conversation. He says bye, and we're back to walking around, and it is functioning perfectly. However, it's not saving it. So if we talk to him again, we leave the scene, come back and talk to him, nothing is saved. That is our next goal. So if you recall, we have these save and load conversation data events in the NPC blueprint. Well, let's override them in the NPC eyes blueprint. And then we'll set up this stuff so that it saves and loads the actual data. So that means we need to go over to the adventure instance and add this information as a variable here. So we'll add a new variable, and we'll call this eyes in hole conversation data. And then we'll make sure that the variable type is set to conversation data and make that an array. And we can move that to a category that is like save data, levels, tower interior. And then in the NPC eyes event graph, we want to get the adventure instance and then set the eyes and whole conversation data equal to conversation data variable that we have already. And now we've saved it. And then for loading it, we're just going to set the conversation data equal to the eyes in whole conversation data on the adventure instance. And it's as simple as that. So we'll add a comment around this and just say it is the save load convo. Now to test it out, I'll just load the game and then talk to the eyes. And then I'll try the who are you option. And he'll answer that. So that's been read. And then maybe I'll try how did you get in here so that that will not be visible anymore. And then maybe I'll try moving to the other topic and selecting one of those. So then I'll just say, what color is this tower? And then I'll leave this topic. And then I'll leave the conversation. And then I'll leave the room and come back in and see if it saves. Talk to him again, and it looks to me like things are saved. And if I switch to the new topic just to make sure, yep, everything's saved. So that's working perfectly. Now we need to save it to the file. So open up the adventure save object, and then we'll just add that variable again, the conversation data that we'll call eyes in wall conversation data. Switch it to the conversation data struct and make it an array. And then I'll just move it into the tower interior category, clean things up, make it easy to find, and compile and save. And then in the adventure instance, I will create a new macro for saving the information in this new level. So I'll create a macro for save tower interior and move that to the saving category, and then make another one called load tower interior and move that to the loading category. And then in both of these functions, I'll add the in and out exec pins. And all I'm doing is assigning the eyes in whole conversation data to the adventure save objects version, and then assigning the adventure save objects version to this one. And then we cannot forget to add the save tower interior to the end of the adventure game save function and the load tower interior to the end of the adventure game load function. Now, if we test it out, it should work. So I'm going to start things from the very beginning and pick up the two items and combine them and open the door. And then I will talk with the person behind the wall. But I'll just do one option just to make sure it saves. So I'll just do, who are you? And we still have to fix that issue with the text jumping around. And then I'll leave the conversation, and then I'll hit 1 to save it once I'm walking around. Okay, now I'm hitting 1, I save it, close this, and play it again. And then I'll hit 2 to load it, talk to the eyes in the hole, and it has saved. It shows both options, and no matter what options we select, it will save all of the information, and it should be working perfectly. Now, to fix that jumping text thing, what we want to do is hide the bark text until all the lines are in there. So Over in the event graph for the bark text, in between the create line and the split bark into lines, let's set the visibility of the bark line holder to hidden. And then at the very end of all of this, on the false branch here, where we see if the bark line index is less than the length, we will set the bark line holder to visible. And really that is all we should need to do. And now it won't show this bark line holder until all the lines are in there. So I'll just talk to the eyes in the hole and do some responses here to see if we notice the jumping text anywhere. It looks like that went well there. So if I say this, yep, it looks like that one doesn't jump either. So I think we're good. Yeah, I've seen 3 examples so far, and none of them have jumped around at all. So that really should be working anyway, based on how we laid it out. So that's going to do it for the dialogue section. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I know it was a lot, but for the overall point-and-click adventure tutorial series, I think I might do one more video where I do a few little cleanup things, but for the most part, I think it's pretty much complete. So thank you for watching. Hope you learned something, and hope you can make some great things with this. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and if you want to be notified of new videos, please hit the bell thing. And I'll see you in the next video.